The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday at Westfield Technical Institute. Students hurried across the frost-covered quad, backpacks slung over shoulders, coffee cups steaming in the crisp Vermont air. But by noon, 3 Black Hawk helicopters would circle the campus before landing directly on the roof of Pine Ridge Dormitory. And every person who had dismissed 18-year-old Zoe Nakamura as just another awkward freshman would finally understand what they had been blind to all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The girl they called Ghost because she seemed to disappear into the background of every room had been quietly building something that would save thousands of lives. The same professors who marked her as unremarkable, the classmates who never bothered learning her name, the department head who tried to kick her out of the program, none of them saw it coming. But the Department of Defense had been watching Zoe Nakamura for months, and what she had created in her cramped dorm room would revolutionize national cybersecurity forever. This is the story of how the most overlooked student at Westfield became the most sought-after mind in America, and why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most important messages. Zoe Nakamura stepped off the Greyhound bus at Burlington Station with everything she owned, crammed into 2 mismatched suitcases and a backpack held together with duct tape. The September morning was crisp with the promise of Vermont's legendary autumn, but Zoe barely noticed the changing leaves. Her attention was fixed on the towering spires of Westfield Technical Institute, visible in the distance, a collection of brick and glass buildings that represented her one shot at a future different from the one poverty had planned for her. The taxi ride to campus cost $23, nearly a quarter of the money she had left after buying her bus ticket from Sacramento. As the driver pulled up to Pine Ridge Dormitory, Zoe counted the bills twice before handing them over, calculating in her head how many meals she'd have to skip to make her remaining funds last until her work-study job started. Westfield Tech was nothing like the community college where she'd spent 2 years accumulating enough credits to transfer. Here, students emerged from luxury cars with parents carrying designer luggage, their conversations peppered with references to family vacation homes and internships at Fortune 500 companies. Zoe watched them move across the manicured quad with the easy confidence that came from never having to worry about where the next meal would come from. Her dormitory room was on the 3rd floor, a cramped double that she'd be sharing with Brooke Sterling, whose social media presence Zoe had reluctantly researched. Brooke's Instagram showcased a lifestyle of ski trips to Aspen, summers in the Hamptons, and a wardrobe that probably cost more than Zoe's entire college fund. When Zoe pushed open the door, she found that Brooke had already claimed the better half of the room, her side decorated with string lights, throw pillows, and framed photos of herself with various celebrity lookalikes. "Oh," Brooke said, looking up from her phone where she was live streaming to her followers. "You must be my roommate. I'm Brooke." She gave Zoe a quick once-over, taking in the second-hand clothes and worn sneakers. "Are you sure you're in the right place? This is the engineering dorm." Zoe nodded, setting down her suitcases on the bare mattress that would be her bed. "I'm Zoe, computer science and cybersecurity track." Brooke's eyebrows rose slightly. It was clear she hadn't expected her scholarship student roommate to be in one of Westfield's most competitive programs. "Well, that's great, just so. You know, I have a lot of study groups here, and my friends come over pretty regularly. I hope that won't be a problem." The unspoken message was clear. Zoe was expected to make herself scarce when Brooke's social life required the space. Zoe simply nodded again, unpacking her few belongings into the small dresser. She'd learned long ago that sometimes silence was the most efficient response. That afternoon brought her first computer science fundamentals lecture in Thornton Hall's largest auditorium. Professor David Klein, a man in his 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, welcomed the incoming students with genuine enthusiasm. "Computer science isn't just about coding," he told the assembled freshmen. "It's about solving problems that matter, building systems that can change the world, and sometimes protecting the world from those who would do it harm." Zoe found herself leaning forward, despite her usual habit of sitting in the back row. This was why she'd struggled through 2 years of community college while working nights at a 24-hour diner. This was why she'd applied for every scholarship available and taken on loans that would take decades to repay. But her enthusiasm dimmed when Dr. Helena Voss entered the room. The cybersecurity department head was a woman who commanded attention. Without effort, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her navy blazer perfectly tailored. She had a reputation that preceded her: brilliant, demanding, and utterly intolerant of mediocrity. "I'll be conducting interviews with all cybersecurity track students over the next week," Dr. Voss announced. "Westfield maintains the highest standards in the field. Not everyone who begins this program will finish it. In fact, historically, 60% of our incoming cybersecurity students transfer to easier majors within their first semester." The number hung in the air like a challenge. Zoe felt her stomach clench, but she forced herself to sit straighter. She hadn't come this far to be intimidated by statistics. When her interview slot came 3 days later, Zoe sat in Dr. Voss's office surrounded by awards, certificates, and photos of the professor with various government officials and tech industry leaders. The walls seemed designed to remind students of exactly how far they'd have to climb to reach that level. "Miss Nakamura," Dr. Voss said, reviewing a file that seemed unusually thin. "Community college transfer, I see. Financial aid recipient. Your transcripts are adequate, but this program requires exceptional aptitude. Tell me, what makes you think you belong in one of the most rigorous cybersecurity programs in the country?" Zoe had prepared for this question, but sitting across from Dr. Voss's penetrating stare, her rehearsed answers seemed inadequate. "I've been interested in computer security since I was 12, she said. "I started learning programming because I wanted to understand how systems could be protected." "Interested," Dr. Voss repeated with a slight frown. "Miss Nakamura, interest is what dilettantes have. This field requires obsession, dedication, and resources. Do you have a laptop?" Zoe nodded toward her backpack, where her 5-year-old Lenovo waited. It was a machine she'd bought used and upgraded piece by piece as she could afford it. "What about access to current security software, professional development courses, industry connections?" Each question felt like a small cut. "Our students typically come to us with substantial backgrounds. Summer programs at MIT, internships at major corporations, parents in the field who can provide guidance." "I don't have those things," Zoe admitted, "but I have this." She pulled out a flash drive from her pocket. "It's a network monitoring tool I've been developing. It can detect anomalous traffic patterns that might indicate security breaches." Dr. Voss glanced at the drive with polite disinterest. "Miss Nakamura, building security tools requires years of advanced study. I'm sure your project shows promise for a community college level, but this program demands a different caliber of work entirely." The dismissal was gentle but absolute. Zoe pocketed the drive, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "Of course, I understand. I'm not trying to discourage you," Dr. Voss continued. "But I've seen many students with backgrounds similar to yours struggle unnecessarily. Have you considered our information systems program? It's more focused on practical applications and might be a better fit for your situation." Zoe left the office feeling smaller than when she'd entered. Information systems was code for the easy track, the program for students who couldn't handle the theoretical rigor of computer science or the specialized demands of cybersecurity. That evening, she sat alone in the dining hall, picking at a sandwich while reading the program requirements for information systems. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Around her, groups of students discuss their classes, their weekend plans, their internship applications for the following summer. Marcus Reed, a junior in the cybersecurity program, held court at a nearby table, regaling his audience with stories of his summer internship at a Silicon Valley startup. The thing about real cybersecurity work, Marcus was saying, his voice carrying easily across the dining hall, is that it's all about rapid response and cutting-edge tools. You need the latest software, the fastest hardware, and connections. In the industry, it's not something you can just pick up from YouTube tutorials. His comment drew laughter from his audience, and Zoe wondered if he'd somehow overheard her conversation with Dr. Voss. The flash drive in her pocket felt heavier, weighted with her naive assumptions about what she might accomplish. Later that night, as Brooke hosted another study group that had somehow turned into a social gathering, Zoe retreated to the common room with her laptop. She'd found a corner where she could work undisturbed, surrounded by the low hum of conversation from students who seemed to navigate Westfield's social and academic hierarchies with effortless grace. She opened her network monitoring tool, the same program Dr. Voss had dismissed so casually. It wasn't much to look at, a simple interface that tracked data flows and flagged unusual patterns. But Zoe had spent months refining the algorithms, testing them on her community college's network, and even running them on public Wi-Fi networks to see what kinds of threats they could detect. As she ran the program on Westfield's guest network, something interesting appeared on her screen. There were data flows that didn't match typical student usage patterns, regular, small transmissions that seemed to be exfiltrating information from somewhere within the university's systems. Most security software would dismiss these as normal background traffic, but Zoe's tool had been designed to look for exactly these kinds of subtle anomalies. She spent the next 2 hours tracing the flows, following digital breadcrumbs through layers of network infrastructure. What she found made her heart race with equal parts excitement and terror. Someone was systematically accessing Westfield's research databases, copying files that contained sensitive information about government contracts and defense-related projects. Zoe stared at her screen, uncertain what to do with this information. She was a freshman who'd been essentially told she didn't belong in the cybersecurity program. Who would believe that her community college-level tool had uncovered what appeared to be a sophisticated data breach? She saved her findings to an encrypted folder and closed her laptop. Tomorrow she would have to decide whether to report what she'd found or simply delete the evidence and focus on her own survival at Westfield. The smart choice, the safe choice, would be to stay quiet and work on transferring to information systems, as Dr. Voss had suggested. But as she walked back to her room, passing groups of students who looked through her as if she were invisible, Zoe made a different choice. She might be poor, she might be inexperienced, and she might not have the right connections, but she had found something that mattered. The question was whether anyone would listen to the girl they'd already written off as another scholarship student who couldn't hack it. The next morning would bring her first real test, and Zoe had no way of knowing that her decision to speak up would set in motion events that would transform not just her own life, but the entire cybersecurity landscape. The girl everyone ignored was about to become the most important voice in the room, whether they were ready to hear her or not. Zoe spent the next 3 weeks living in two worlds. During the day, she attended classes where professors looked through her and classmates forgot her name before introductions finished. But at night, she descended into a digital realm where she was building something extraordinary. Her investigation into Westfield's network breach had revealed layers of complexity that both thrilled and terrified her. The attackers weren't random hackers looking for credit card numbers or personal information. They were conducting systematic espionage, targeting specific research projects tied to Department of Defense contracts. Westfield's partnerships with government agencies made it a treasure trove of sensitive information, and someone was methodically looting it. Working from the common room after midnight, when even the most dedicated partiers had finally gone to bed, Zoe had traced the attack back to its source. The malware was sophisticated, designed to mimic legitimate network traffic, while exfiltrating data in tiny packets that would never trigger conventional security systems. It had been active for months, possibly longer, operating with the patience of a professional intelligence operation. Her old Lenovo struggled with the computational demands of her analysis, but Zoe had learned to work within limitations. She wrote code that was elegant in its efficiency, programs that could accomplish in 3 lines what others might need 30 to achieve. Poverty had taught her that resources were precious, and that lesson translated perfectly to programming, where every cycle of processing power mattered. Professor Klein had become an unexpected ally, though he didn't know the extent of what she was investigating. During his office hours, which Zoe attended religiously while other students skipped them for social events, he encouraged her curiosity about network security. He lent her textbooks from his personal collection, books that would have cost her hundreds of dollars to purchase. "You have an intuitive understanding of systems," he told her one Thursday afternoon as she returned a volume on cryptographic protocols. "Most students learn the rules and try to apply them. You seem to understand why the rules exist in the first place." Professor Klein's encouragement meant everything to Zoe, especially as her situation in the cybersecurity program grew more precarious. Dr. Voss had made it clear during subsequent interactions that she considered Zoe's presence in advanced courses to be a charitable accommodation rather than an earned right. When Zoe asked questions in Voss's network security fundamentals class, the professor would pause with barely concealed impatience before providing answers that suggested the questions themselves were beneath the level of discourse she expected. "Miss Nakamura," Dr. Voss had said after a particularly detailed question about intrusion detection systems, "these concepts will become clearer as you develop more foundational knowledge. Perhaps you should focus on the basic material before concerning yourself with advanced applications." The comment had stung because Zoe's question had actually been based on her real-world investigation of the campus breach. She was trying to understand how professional intrusion detection systems could be evaded so completely, but she couldn't explain her true motivation without revealing what she'd discovered. Marcus Reed had appointed himself as Dr. Voss's unofficial spokesperson among the students, and he took particular pleasure in reinforcing the professor's subtle dismissals. During study groups that Zoe tried to join, he would interrupt her contributions with comments like, "That's an interesting perspective, but in industry practice, we typically approach these problems differently." His tone suggested that Zoe's ideas came from textbooks while his came from real experience, conveniently ignoring the fact that his industry experience consisted of a single summer internship where he'd mostly fetched coffee for actual cybersecurity professionals. The social isolation at Westfield was different from anything Zoe had experienced. At community college, being poor had made her part of the majority. Here, her second-hand clothes and careful meal planning marked her as fundamentally different from classmates who thought nothing of spending $40 on dinner or flying home for long weekends. She learned to eat alone, study alone, and navigate the complex social hierarchies that governed everything from study group invitations to internship recommendations. But isolation had its advantages. While other students spent hours on social media and weekend parties, Zoe worked. Her investigation had expanded beyond simply identifying the breach to understanding how it functioned and, more importantly, how it could be stopped. She had built what she privately called the Shepherd protocol, a security system that could detect and neutralize the exact type of attack currently plaguing Westfield's network. The Shepherd protocol wasn't like anything Zoe had read about in her textbooks or anything Marcus Reed had ever boasted about during his internship in Silicon Valley. It wasn't just a defensive system. It was built to think like an attacker. anticipating every move in the ongoing cyber cat-and-mouse game. Rather than blocking known threats, it adapted in real time, learning from attack patterns and evolving as new threats emerged. At 2 in the morning, alone in the common room, Zoe had run her protocol through a gauntlet of simulated attacks, some of the most advanced she could design. Each time, the system adapted and defended itself successfully. But simulation wasn't the same as facing live attackers. Real-world testing was the next step, and the chance came sooner than expected. Kei Chun, another student on the margins of campus life, but for different reasons than Zoe, noticed her one night. Brilliant but easily bored, Kai routinely completed assignments early and found little challenge in the slow pace of academia. They'd crossed paths before in their database security course, where Zoe's deep, insightful questions had caught his attention. "You're always here late," he said, sitting near her in the common room. "Working on something interesting?" Zoe hesitated. She'd kept her investigation quiet, unsure of whom to trust. But Kai had a reputation for keeping things to himself, and more importantly, he had access to university systems her old laptop couldn't touch. "I've been tracking unusual activity on the network," she said cautiously. "Someone's been accessing sensitive databases without authorization." Kai leaned in, intrigued. "Corporate espionage? Or just your average hacker?" "More than just a bored script kiddie," Zoe said. "They're targeting research tied to government projects. It's been going on for months, completely under the radar." "How'd you even catch this?" Zoe showed him her custom-built monitoring tool and explained how it flagged traffic patterns that standard systems ignored. Kai examined her code with the intensity of someone who understood its depth. "This is seriously impressive," he said. "Where'd you learn to write algorithms like this?" "Trial and error. A lot of sleepless nights." The compliment caught her off guard. It had been weeks since anyone acknowledged her work. From that point on, Kai became her closest collaborator. Though they kept their work quiet, he gave her access to more powerful systems through his IT job, and his understanding of the university's network proved essential. As they dug deeper, it became clear the breach was worse than Zoe had suspected. Research in quantum computing, materials science, and advanced telecom systems was being siphoned off, years of work, stolen, and transmitted to external servers. "We have to report this," Kai said after compiling the full scope. "This isn't just a university issue. This is national security." They brought their findings to Dr. Voss, hoping for support. But the meeting took a turn. Voss was skeptical from the start, interrupting frequently and questioning their conclusions. When they finished, she looked at them with a mix of irritation and disbelief. "Miss Nakamura, Mr. Chun, I appreciate your enthusiasm," she said. "But what you're suggesting is absurd. Our systems are state-of-the-art and regularly audited by external security firms. We wouldn't have federal research contracts otherwise." Zoe tried to present the flash drive containing their documentation, but Voss cut her off. "The so-called evidence," she said, "was gathered through unauthorized surveillance. You're students without the training to accurately interpret what you've seen. What you think is suspicious might be routine maintenance or backup operations." Kai pushed back. "But the data is being transferred to servers outside the university. Mr. Chun, you're a sophomore. You don't have experience with enterprise-level systems. That doesn't make normal traffic patterns malicious." Her tone was condescending, her words dismissive. Then came the accusation that their actions bordered on illegal activity. Zoe's stomach dropped. She had only tried to protect the university, but now she saw how easily their work could be seen as a violation. "We didn't hack anything," she insisted. "We just monitored traffic patterns." "Without permission," Voss emphasized. "When I suggested you consider the Information Systems Program, Miss Nakamura, this is exactly what I meant. Real security work demands discipline, not reckless improvisation." They left her office deflated, despite presenting solid evidence. Their concerns had been brushed off as amateur overreach. "She's not going to do a thing," Kai muttered. Meanwhile, the breach continues. Zoe nodded, but her mind was already searching for another path. Dr. Voss might control the cybersecurity program, but she wasn't the only authority on campus. Professor Klein became their next option. Though he wasn't in the cybersecurity department, he had broad connections within the university and had always respected Zoe's potential. They arranged a meeting in his office late Friday, when the campus had mostly cleared out. They walked him through the same findings, this time to a different reaction. Klein asked smart, technical questions and followed their logic with real interest. He reviewed their documentation carefully and didn't interrupt with skepticism. When they finished, he sat in silence for a moment, staring at the data. "This is serious," he said finally. "If what you're showing me is accurate, this breach could be affecting sensitive research nationwide." Dr. Voss said our evidence wasn't credible, Kai added. Klein's expression tightened. "She's talented, but sometimes too entangled in university politics to see clearly. Your status as students doesn't invalidate solid data." After another pause, Klein made a decision that would alter everything. "I'm going to forward this to someone I know at the NSSE, specializes in threats like this. He can evaluate your findings without the institutional bias you've encountered here." Zoe was caught between two powerful emotions: relief that someone was finally validating her discovery, and fear that real NSA analysts would tear apart her work and expose every flaw she hadn't noticed. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, hesitantly. "What if we missed something? What if there's a logical explanation we didn't think of?" Professor Klein didn't hesitate. "If that's the case, we'll learn from it. But Zoe, I've reviewed your findings. They're thorough, logical, and carefully constructed. Your investigative work is on par with grad students, actually better than most, and you're just a freshman." That weekend, while her classmates relaxed, partied, and lived out the kind of college life she couldn't afford, Zoe refined every part of her research. She verified data paths, double-checked conclusions, and created meticulous documentation so that professionals could replicate her analysis step by step. She had no way of knowing that within 72 hours her report would land on the desk of Lieutenant Colonel James Parker at the NSA, nor could she have imagined that her quiet work would trigger a multi-agency investigation, or that, within weeks, her name would be whispered at the highest levels of national security. All she knew was that what she'd uncovered mattered. It mattered more than grades, more than social circles, more than her long-standing struggle to fit in at Westfield. For the first time, Zoe felt truly aligned with her purpose. The girl everyone overlooked had just handed the government a lead on one of the most advanced cyber espionage efforts in recent history. She was about to learn that the most critical battles often happen not in classrooms or social cliques, but deep within the hidden architecture of the digital world. The call came Tuesday morning. Zoe was eating breakfast alone, her second-hand phone sitting beside her tray. It rarely rang except for work-study updates or an occasional call from her mom in Sacramento. When she saw Professor Klein on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. "Zoe," he said, his voice uncharacteristically tense, "come to my office right away. Someone wants to talk to you about your research." She arrived to find Professor Klein pacing nervously. Across from him stood a sharply dressed man studying her printed report. He was tall, likely in his mid-40s, with the focused posture of someone with a military background. His gaze was sharp, observant, and evaluating. "Miss Nakamura," Klein said, gesturing toward the visitor, "this is Lieutenant Colonel James Parker from the National Security Agency. He's here about your findings on the network breach." Parker rose and extended a firm, professional handshake, unlike anything Zoe had experienced from someone in authority. "I've spent the last 18 hours reviewing your report," he said. "I have a number of very specific questions." For the next 2 hours, Parker grilled her on every detail. He wanted to know how she'd spotted the anomalies, the tools she'd used, and the logic behind her detection algorithms. His questions were sharp, technical, clearly coming from someone with deep domain knowledge. "Your algorithm," he said, scanning her code again, "detected attack patterns that our systems completely missed. How did you know what to look for?" Zoe paused, searching for the right words. The traffic was too clean. Real users leave inconsistencies, delays, mistakes, variation. The malicious activity was too regular. It didn't feel human. Parker nodded slowly. "You were right. We've seen similar activity at other universities, but we hadn't traced the method they were using until now." Zoe's breath caught in her throat. She'd thought this was a local breach, just a problem at Westfield. Now she realized it was part of a national-level intrusion. "There's another matter," Parker added. "The defensive system you created, the Shepard Protocol. Our team believes it represents a major leap in autonomous threat detection. We'd like to explore broader applications." Until that moment, Professor Klein had stayed silent. Now he spoke, his voice deliberate. "Colonel, you should know Zoe initially tried to raise these concerns through official university channels. The cybersecurity department ignored her." Parker's expression darkened. "Ignored her how?" "Dr. Voss dismissed the findings outright," Zoe said, cautious. "She claimed the traffic I flagged was normal maintenance or synchronization processes." "Did she actually review the evidence?" "She glanced at it. Said we didn't have the training to interpret network behavior accurately." Zoe could still feel the sting of that dismissal, though Parker's presence confirmed she hadn't been wrong. He closed her file and turned to the window for a long moment, then spoke with calm finality. "Miss Nakamura, let me be clear, this isn't just about Westfield. You've uncovered signs of a long-running foreign operation that's been infiltrating U.S. research institutions for at least 2 years. The gravity of his words settled over the room. Zoe had sensed this was serious, but not on this scale. "We'll need your help developing a response," Parker continued. "But be prepared, this may put you in a difficult position here. The people who dismissed you won't take kindly to being proven wrong by a freshman." That warning became real later that day, when Zoe was summoned to Dr. Voss's office, something she'd been dreading. She arrived to find not just Voss, but Marcus Reed and 2 senior students from the cybersecurity program already seated. The moment Zoe walked in, she knew this wasn't a normal meeting. "Miss Nakamura," Voss began, her voice icy and formal, "it's been brought to my attention that you've been sharing sensitive information about university network security with unauthorized individuals." "I presented my findings to Professor Klein," Zoe answered evenly. "He facilitated contact with someone capable of evaluating the threat properly." "Professor Klein isn't part of the cybersecurity department," Marcus cut in quickly, his tone sharp. "He doesn't have the expertise to assess network security issues." Dr. Voss nodded approvingly at Marcus's comment. "Mr. Reed raises an important point. You bypassed the proper chain of command and potentially exposed sensitive information about university systems to unauthorized personnel." "The NSA isn't unauthorized personnel," Zoe said, her voice sharper than she'd intended. "And the information I shared documented criminal activity that's been ongoing for months. The NSA?" Dr. Voss's eyebrows rose in what might have been surprise or theatrical disbelief. "Miss Nakamura, are you claiming that federal agents are taking seriously the network monitoring activities of a freshman student?" The question was loaded with implications about credibility and appropriate academic hierarchy. In Dr. Voss's worldview, important discoveries came from established experts, not from students who couldn't even pass the program's initial requirements. "Lieutenant Colonel Parker spent 2 hours reviewing my evidence," Zoe said. "He confirmed That what I found represents a serious security breach affecting multiple institutions. Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. Right. A lieutenant colonel from the NSA is consulting with freshmen now. That sounds totally plausible. Mr. Reed makes a valid point, Dr. Vos agreed. Miss Nakamura, I'm concerned that you may be exaggerating your interactions with supposed federal officials to justify unauthorized network monitoring activities. The accusation of lying hit harder than anything else Dr. Vos had said. Zoe felt her cheeks burn with anger and humiliation. But she forced herself to remain calm. You can verify my statements with Professor Klein. He was present during the entire meeting. What I can verify, Dr. Vos replied, is that you've demonstrated consistent poor judgment throughout your time in this program. You've conducted unauthorized network scanning, made unfounded allegations about system compromises, and now you're claiming to be working with federal agencies. She opened a file folder on her desk and removed a single sheet of paper. This is a recommendation for your immediate transfer to the Information Systems program. Given your academic struggles and behavioral concerns, I believe it's in your best interest to pursue a less demanding course of study. The transfer recommendation felt like a death sentence. Information Systems wasn't just an easier program. It was academic exile, a clear signal that she didn't belong among serious computer science students. Worse, it would end any possibility of working with Lieutenant Colonel Parker on the cybersecurity investigation that had become the most important thing in her life. Dr. Vos, Zoe said, I understand that my background is different from other students in this program. But the evidence I've gathered is valid regardless of who discovered it. The university is under attack, and transferring me to another program won't change that. Miss Nakamura, what you call evidence consists of network traffic patterns that you lack the experience to interpret correctly. Your insistence on this fantasy about sophisticated attacks and federal investigations suggests a concerning detachment from reality. The words were carefully chosen, designed to make Zoe sound delusional rather than simply wrong. Around the room, the senior students nodded in agreement with their professor's assessment. To them, the idea that a struggling freshman could uncover threats that had eluded professional security systems was inherently absurd. I'm not transferring, Zoe said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. My work is valid, my findings are accurate, and I have every right to be in this program. Dr. Vos's expression hardened. Miss Nakamura, you're forgetting that program enrollment is a privilege, not a right. Students who demonstrate poor judgment, academic struggles, or behavioral problems can and will be removed. Then you'll have to explain to Lieutenant Colonel Parker why you're obstructing a federal investigation. The statement hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Zoe had played her strongest card, gambling that Parker's involvement carried enough weight to protect her from Dr. Vos's retaliation. Marcus broke the silence with another dismissive laugh. This is getting ridiculous. Next, she claimed the FBI is interested in her coding assignments, but Dr. Vos wasn't laughing. Something in Zoe's tone, or perhaps the specific details she'd mentioned, had given her pause. Miss Nakamura, if you're genuinely claiming to be involved in a federal investigation, then I'll need to see official documentation of that involvement. I can arrange for Lieutenant Colonel Parker to meet with you directly, Zoe offered. He can explain the significance of what I've discovered and why it matters for national security. The offer put Dr. Vos in an impossible position. If she continued to dismiss Zoe's claims and later learned they were legitimate, her career could suffer serious consequences. But accepting that a freshman had uncovered a major security threat that the cybersecurity department had missed would be professionally humiliating. Very well, Dr. Vos said after a long pause. I'll give you 48 hours to produce this Lieutenant Colonel Parker and his official validation of your claims. If you can't provide concrete proof of federal involvement in your supposed investigation, you'll be transferred to information systems immediately. As Zoe left the office, she heard Marcus telling the other students, "This is going to be hilarious when she shows up Friday with nobody." Delusional people always double down when they're caught. Walking across campus toward Professor Klein's office, Zoe realized she just committed herself to a confrontation that would determine not only her academic future, but also her ability to continue working on what might be the most important discovery of her life. She had 48 hours to prove that the quiet girl everyone ignored had been right about everything, or face the consequences of challenging an entire department's expertise and authority. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and Zoe had never felt more alone. But she'd also never been more certain that she was fighting for something that mattered, more than grades or social acceptance or professional advancement. She was fighting for the truth, and for the first time in her life, she had allies who were powerful enough to help her win. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp Vermont clarity that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Zoe had spent the previous 2 days in a state of controlled anxiety, working with Lieutenant Colonel Parker to arrange a meeting that would either vindicate her completely or destroy her academic career forever. At exactly 10 o'clock, she walked into the cybersecurity department's main conference room to find Dr. Voss waiting with Marcus Reed and 3 other faculty members. Their expressions ranged from skeptical curiosity to barely concealed anticipation of her inevitable humiliation. "Miss Nakamura," Dr. Voss said, consulting her watch with theatrical precision, "you promised to produce federal officials who would validate your claims about network intrusions and security threats. Where are these mysterious government agents?" "They'll be here," Zoe said, taking a seat at the conference table despite not being invited to sit. Her hands were steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Marcus leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone watching a long-anticipated entertainment. "This is going to be epic when nobody shows up. I mean, what did she think would happen? That she could just claim to be working with the NSA and nobody would call her bluff?" At 10:03, the conference room door opened to admit Professor Klein, followed by Lieutenant Colonel Parker in full military dress uniform. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Dr. Voss straightened in her chair, her expression shifting from confident authority to cautious uncertainty. Parker surveyed the room with the kind of commanding presence that filled every corner without effort. When he spoke, his voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously by very important people. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel James Parker, National Security Agency, Cyber Threat Intelligence Division," he said, placing his credentials on the table where everyone could see them. "I'm here to discuss Miss Nakamura's discovery of what we now know to be one of the most sophisticated cyber espionage operations targeting American research institutions in the past decade." The silence that followed was profound. Marcus's smug expression had transformed into something approaching panic, while the faculty members stared at Parker as if he were an exotic species they'd never encountered before. Dr. Voss recovered. First, her training in academic diplomacy overriding her shock. "Colonel Parker, we appreciate your time, but I think there may be some misunderstanding about the scope and significance of Miss Nakamura's activities." "No misunderstanding," Parker replied curtly. He opened a briefcase and removed a thick folder. Miss Nakamura identified attack vectors that had completely evaded our existing detection systems. Her analysis revealed systematic data exfiltration from at least 12 major research universities, with estimated losses in the tens of millions of dollars and decades of research progress. He turned to address the room directly. "The monitoring system she developed has detected threats that our most advanced cybersecurity tools missed entirely. We've implemented her Shepherd protocol across multiple government networks, and it's already prevented 3 major intrusions that would have compromised classified defense research." Professor Davis, one of the senior faculty members, leaned forward with obvious confusion. "Colonel, are you saying that a freshman student has developed cybersecurity tools that exceed government capabilities?" "I'm saying that Miss Nakamura has demonstrated exactly the kind of innovative thinking and practical skill that our field desperately needs," Parker replied. "She identified patterns that experienced analysts missed because she wasn't constrained by conventional assumptions about what attack should look like." Dr. Voss had been growing increasingly pale as Parker spoke. Now she attempted to regain control of the situation. "Colonel, while we appreciate Miss Nakamura's enthusiasm, the fact remains that she lacks the foundational knowledge and experience necessary for advanced cybersecurity work. Her academic performance has been marginal at best." Parker's expression hardened. "Dr. Voss, I've reviewed Miss Nakamura's academic record. She's maintaining a 3.8 GPA while working 20 hours per week to pay for her education. Her performance in technical courses exceeds 90% of students in this program. But her practical experience," Marcus began, then stopped when Parker's attention focused on him like a laser. "And you are?" "Marcus Reed, junior in the cybersecurity program. I've done internships at major Silicon Valley companies, and I can tell you that real-world cybersecurity requires tools and experience that you can't get from textbooks." Parker studied Marcus for a moment before responding. "Mr. Reed, I've also reviewed your academic record and your internship evaluations. According to your supervisors at TechFlow Solutions, you spent most of your time organizing supply closets and occasionally updating documentation. Miss Nakamura has accomplished more in 4 months than you have in 3 years." The statement landed like a physical blow. Marcus's face turned red, and he opened his mouth to argue, but Parker continued without pause. "Which brings me to the more serious issue," Parker said, turning back to Dr. Voss. "When Miss Nakamura attempted to report her findings through proper channels, she was dismissed without serious consideration. A critical national security threat was ignored because the messenger didn't fit your expectations of what an expert should look like." Dr. Voss straightened defensively. "Colonel, we receive numerous reports from students who believe they've discovered security issues. Most of these turn out to be false alarms or misunderstandings. We have to prioritize our attention based on credibility assessments." "Credibility assessments based on what criteria?" Parker's voice carried dangerous quiet. Miss Nakamura provided detailed technical evidence supporting her conclusions. Her methodology was sound, her analysis was thorough, and her conclusions were accurate. What about her presentation suggested a lack of credibility? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Everyone in the room understood the implications. Dr. Voss had dismissed Zoe not because her evidence was flawed, but because she was young, poor, and didn't fit the profile of students who typically made important discoveries. "I think what Dr. Voss means," Professor Davis interjected diplomatically, "is that we see many student projects that seem sophisticated but lack real-world applicability. It's difficult to distinguish between promising work and naive enthusiasm." Parker nodded as if considering this point. "I understand that distinction can be challenging, which is why I'd like to demonstrate exactly how applicable Miss Nakamura's work has proven to be." He pulled out a tablet and connected it to the conference room's display system. The screen filled with network traffic visualizations, attack pattern analyses, and threat assessment reports. 3 weeks ago, we implemented Ms. Nakamura's Shepherd protocol on the Department of Defense's research network. Within 6 hours, it had identified and neutralized an active intrusion that had been ongoing for 8 months. The attackers had gained access to classified materials related to quantum computing research. The room was completely silent now, everyone staring at the display with expressions ranging from awe to horror. 2 days later, the system detected and prevented an attempt to compromise the Centers for Disease Control's pandemic response databases. The attack would have given foreign actors access to sensitive information about vaccine development and distribution planning. Parker clicked to the next slide, showing a timeline of detected threats and prevented intrusions. In the 3 weeks since implementation, Ms. Nakamura's system has identified 47 separate attack attempts, prevented 12 successful breaches, and provided intelligence that has led to the disruption of 3 major cyber espionage networks. Dr. Vos stared at the screen as if it contained information that violated the fundamental laws of physics. The implications of what you're describing are exactly what Ms. Nakamura tried to explain to you 6 weeks ago, Parker finished. She identified a systematic threat to American research infrastructure and developed countermeasures that have proven effective against the most sophisticated attackers in the world. He closed the tablet and faced the room with the authority of someone delivering final judgment. The Department of Defense is prepared to offer Ms. Nakamura a full scholarship to complete her education, followed by a position in our Cyber Threat Intelligence Division. Her starting salary would be higher than what most of your graduates earn after 5 years in the field. Marcus looked like he was about to be sick. The golden future he'd imagined for himself had just been offered to the girl he'd spent months mocking as a wannabe hacker playing with toy computers. However, Parker continued, Ms. Nakamura has expressed a preference to complete her degree at Westfield, provided she can do so in an environment that recognizes and nurtures her abilities rather than dismissing them. Dr. Vos found her voice, though it came out smaller than her usual commanding tone. Colonel, I think there may have been miscommunications about Ms. Nakamura's status in our program. We've always recognized her potential. Dr. Vos, 3 days ago you recommended her immediate transfer to information systems because you questioned her academic capabilities and professional judgment. The accuracy of Parker's information was devastating. It was clear that he'd been thoroughly briefed on every aspect of Zoe's treatment at Westfield, and he wasn't inclined to accept face-saving explanations. I believe I may have been hasty in that assessment, Dr. Vos admitted, her academic career flashing before her eyes. Perhaps we should reconsider Ms. Nakamura's placement in our advanced tracks. Perhaps you should, Parker agreed with ice-cold politeness, because the alternative is explaining to the Department of Defense why Westfield Technical Institute attempted to remove from its cybersecurity program the student who has made the most significant contribution to national cyber defense in the past 5 years. The meeting continued for another hour, but the outcome had been decided in those first devastating minutes. By the time Lieutenant Colonel Parker left the conference room, Zoe had been officially reinstated in the cybersecurity program with full departmental support, access to advanced resources, and a research assistantship that would cover her remaining educational expenses. As the faculty members filed out in stunned silence, Marcus approached Zoe with the hollow expression of someone whose entire worldview had just collapsed. I don't understand, he said quietly. How did you see things that nobody else could see? Zoe looked at him for a moment, remembering every snide comment, every dismissive laugh, every time he'd made her feel small and inadequate. She could have been cruel in victory, could have returned every humiliation he'd heaped on her. Instead, she said simply, I wasn't looking for what I expected to find. I was looking for what was actually there. That afternoon, alone in her dorm room while Brooke attended yet another social event, Zoe stared at her reflection in the small mirror above her desk. The shy freshman who had arrived at Westfield 4 months ago was gone, replaced by someone who had proven that quiet competence could triumph over loud confidence, that careful observation could outweigh hasty judgment, and that sometimes the most important voices belonged to those who had been forced to listen carefully because nobody was listening to them. But her transformation was just beginning. What she didn't know was that Lieutenant Colonel Parker's visit had triggered a chain reaction that would reshape not only her life but the entire landscape of cybersecurity education and national defense. The girl who had arrived with everything to prove was about to discover that proving yourself was only the beginning of a much larger responsibility. 6 months later, Zoe stood in the newly constructed Cybersecurity Operations Center on the top floor of Thornton Hall, watching her fellow students work at state-of-the-art, monitoring stations that hadn't existed when she'd been analyzing network traffic on her ancient laptop in the common room. The transformation of Westfield Technical Institute had been as dramatic as her own journey from dismissed outsider to the most sought-after student on campus. The morning that changed everything forever had started unremarkably. Zoe was in her Advanced Threat Analysis seminar, a course that had been created specifically around her research and was now taught jointly by Professor Klein and a rotating series of guest instructors from various government agencies. She'd grown comfortable with the attention, though she still preferred working behind the scenes to being in the spotlight. At exactly 11:47 a.m., every student's phone in the classroom buzzed simultaneously with an emergency alert. Active cyber attack in progress. All cybersecurity students report to Operations Center immediately. This is not a drill. The Operations Center had been designed as a training facility where students could practice responding to simulated threats in a controlled environment. But as Zoe and her classmates rushed up the stairs, they found Lieutenant Colonel Parker coordinating with a team of federal agents and military personnel who had apparently materialized on campus without warning. "Miss Nakamura," Parker called out the moment he saw her. "We need the Shepherd Protocol active immediately. We're facing a coordinated attack on critical infrastructure systems across the northeastern United States. Power grids, water treatment facilities, financial networks, everything is being hit simultaneously." The Operations Center had been transformed into something resembling a military command post. Multiple screens displayed network traffic from dozens of critical systems, and the attack patterns were unlike anything Zoe had seen before. These weren't the methodical, stealthy intrusions she'd identified at Westfield. This was digital warfare, on a scale that defied imagination. The attackers are using advanced, persistent threats that adapt their methods in real time, explained Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI Cyber Division. "Every time our defensive systems identify and block one attack vector, the malware evolves and finds a new approach." It felt like battling an enemy that could learn and evolve faster than any human analyst could respond to. Zoe stared at the stream of data across the screen, her eyes locked in the kind of laser-focused intensity that had become her signature. The attack patterns were more advanced than anything she'd ever seen, but something about them felt familiar. Beneath the complexity, she recognized structural echoes of the breaches she'd first uncovered at the university. "This is the same group," she said, her voice cutting through the tense energy of the command center. "The ones who targeted research institutions. But now, they've turned what they learned into weapons. They're not just stealing data anymore, they're attacking the systems that keep society running." Dr. Voss stood at the edge of the room, looking visibly shaken. She stepped forward, clearly struggling to keep up. "You're saying the intrusions you discovered 6 months ago are connected to this?" "They're not just connected," Zoe replied, her fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. "They are the foundation. Those university breaches were recon missions. They were mapping out our digital infrastructure, learning how it works, where it's weak, and how to break it." Lieutenant Colonel Parker nodded grimly. "That matches our intel. The attackers have spent years infiltrating research labs, government contractors, private sector firms, gathering intelligence on our cyber systems. This was all prep work for what's happening now." On the main wall of screens, alerts lit up in a rapid cascade, far too fast for human response. Teams to keep up. Power grids in several states were reporting critical control issues. Water treatment plants were experiencing equipment failures. Financial systems were showing severe processing delays that could spiral into a full-blown collapse. How soon can the Shepherd protocol be deployed? Agent Martinez asked, her voice tight with urgency. Zoe was already typing, but the scale of the crisis was staggering. Her system had been built to protect isolated networks, not defend the entire nation's infrastructure. I have to rewrite the core algorithms to support distributed deployment across diverse systems, she said. I need 20 minutes. We might not have 20, Parker replied, gesturing toward the flashing displays. If New York's power grid collapses during peak demand, the chain reaction could leave tens of millions in the dark. Inside the command center, students who had once seen Zoe as a quiet, distant classmate now watched her with awe and fear. Marcus Reed, who'd once mocked her, openly sat frozen, unable to look away as she calmly unraveled attack vectors that were overwhelming veteran federal analysts. I can help, Kai-Chun said, sliding into the workstation beside her. I know your code inside out. If we split the work, we can deploy faster. Others stepped forward, 2 students from different programs, offering what skills they had. In the middle of the crisis, something remarkable was taking shape. A joint response effort between federal agencies and a university tech team. Professor Klein managed the technical coordination, while Dr. Vos, still clearly overwhelmed, but trying to contribute, handled communications with campus leadership and emergency services. As Zoe worked, everything around her seemed to fall away. The noise, the pressure, the fear, it all faded. What remained was the logic of the system, the rhythm of the code. This was her zone. This was the place where she belonged. Modified Shepherd protocol is ready, she announced after 18 relentless minutes. But I need full administrative access to every system we're defending: power grids, financial networks, utilities, communication infrastructure, everything. Agent Martinez stared in shock. You're asking for root access to the most sensitive systems in the country. That kind of clearance requires executive-level approval. Then get it, Parker said immediately. Because she's our best and maybe only chance to stop this. What followed was 30 minutes of frantic coordination. Emergency clearance requests, fast-tracked authorizations, bureaucratic red tape slashed in record time. Top officials scrambled to get sign-off from the highest levels of government. And then, the confirmation came: grave, formal, and world-altering. The President of the United States had personally approved full access rights for an 18-year-old freshman, because every expert agreed that her system offered the only real shot at stopping the attack. Beginning deployment now, Zoe sighed, her voice steady and calm. Around her, monitors lit up as the Shepherd protocol spread across the networks like immune cells swarming a virus. The response was immediate. Attack vectors that had overwhelmed traditional defenses were neutralized within seconds. The enemy malware couldn't adapt quickly enough. The system was outpacing them. The massive cyber assault, once poised to cripple entire regions of critical infrastructure, began to unravel. Strategic plans built over years were collapsing. In real time, as Zoe's creation outmaneuvered each threat, faster than any attacker could react. Power grid anomalies are stabilizing, reported one of the federal technicians. Water treatment systems are responding normally. Financial networks are processing transactions without errors. But Zoe wasn't celebrating yet. She could see that the attackers were regrouping, trying to develop new approaches that could overcome her defenses. This wasn't over. It was entering a new phase that would test both her system and her own ability to think several moves ahead of adversaries who had been planning this operation for years. They're adapting faster than I expected, she told Lieutenant Colonel Parker. The Shepherd protocol is learning from their attempts, but they're learning from its responses too. This is turning into an intelligence battle, where both sides are evolving their strategies in real time. For the next 6 hours, Zoe engaged in what could only be described as intellectual combat with some of the most sophisticated cybercriminals in the world. Every move they made was countered by her system, but every countermove revealed new information that they used to develop more advanced attacks. It was like playing chess with an opponent who could see her pieces but was slowly learning the rules as the game progressed. The turning point came when Zoe realized that her adversaries were making a fundamental error in their approach. They were treating the battle as a purely technical challenge, focusing on exploiting system vulnerabilities and overwhelming defensive measures with superior computational resources. But Zoe understood something they didn't. Cyber warfare wasn't just about technology. It was about understanding the human behaviors and institutional structures that technology was designed to support. "I know how to stop them," she announced suddenly, her voice cutting through the tense atmosphere of the operations center. "They're attacking our systems like they're isolated networks, but our infrastructure is designed around human decision-making processes. If I can predict their next moves based on the social and economic impacts they're trying to achieve, I can position defenses where they don't expect them." Lieutenant Colonel Parker leaned over her shoulder as she explained her strategy. Instead of simply reacting to attacks as they occurred, the modified Shepard protocol would anticipate likely targets, based on psychological profiles of the attackers and the strategic objectives their previous actions revealed. "You're turning cybersecurity into behavioral analysis," Parker observed. "Instead of just protecting systems, you're predicting human intentions and positioning defenses accordingly." "Exactly," Zoe replied, implementing her new approach across the network. "Technology is just the tool. The real battle is between human minds, and I've been studying how these particular minds work for almost a year." The results were spectacular. Attack after attack failed as the Shepard protocol anticipated assault vectors before they were fully developed. The sophisticated malware that had threatened to cripple American infrastructure found itself consistently outmaneuvered by defensive systems that seemed to understand its purpose better than its own creators. By evening, the coordinated cyber assault had been completely neutralized. The attackers, faced with defensive measures that predicted their every move, had retreated to regroup and develop new strategies. Critical infrastructure systems across the northeastern United States continued operating normally, and millions of Americans went about their daily lives completely unaware of how close they had come to disaster. As federal agents began packing up their equipment and military personnel prepared to return to their bases, Lieutenant Colonel Parker approached Zoe with an expression that mixed profound respect with something approaching disbelief. "Miss Nakamura," he said, "what you accomplished today saved countless lives and prevented economic damage that could have taken years to recover from. The President asked me to convey his personal thanks and to inform you that you'll be receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor this country can bestow." Zoe nodded politely, but her attention was already shifting to the lessons learned from the day's battle. Every attack and counterattack had revealed new information about both her own system's capabilities and her adversaries' methods. She was already planning improvements that would make future defensive operations even more effective. Dr. Voss, who had spent the day watching her former problem student coordinate a national defense effort, approached hesitantly. "Zoe," she said, using her first name for the first time anyone could remember, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond anything I said in my office 6 months ago. I failed to recognize not just your abilities, but the kind of thinking our field desperately needs." "Dr. Voss," Zoe replied, "you taught me something important about the difference between proving I could solve problems and proving that my solutions could work in the real world. Both lessons were necessary." As the operations center returned to its normal state as a training facility, students began to understand that they had witnessed the birth of an entirely new approach to cybersecurity education. The events of the day had demonstrated that the most important battles of the future would be fought not just by established experts with traditional credentials, but by innovative thinkers who could see patterns that others missed. Westfield Technical Institute would never be the same. The university that had once tried to transfer Zoe to an easier program now found itself at the center of a revolution in cybersecurity education. Students from around the world applied for admission to study under the professors who had trained the young woman who saved American infrastructure from digital destruction. But for Zoe, the recognition and accolades were secondary to a deeper understanding of her purpose. The shy freshman who had arrived with worn luggage and second-hand clothes had discovered that her greatest strength wasn't her technical ability or her innovative thinking. It was her willingness to listen carefully, to observe patiently, and to speak up when something mattered, regardless of whether anyone was ready to hear her voice. 3 weeks later, as she sat in her redesigned dorm room reviewing applications from students who wanted to study her methods, Zoe heard a familiar sound outside her window. Looking up, she saw 3 Black Hawk helicopters circling the campus. Before landing on the roof of Pine Ridge Dormitory, Lieutenant Colonel Parker was returning with a delegation of military and government officials who wanted to discuss the establishment of a new national cybersecurity training center at Westfield, with Zoe as its youngest faculty member and primary research director. As she watched the helicopters settle onto the roof, Zoe reflected on the journey that had brought her from dismissed outsider to the most important voice in American cybersecurity. The girl everyone had ignored had become impossible to overlook, not through self-promotion or political maneuvering, but by consistently being right when it mattered most. She closed her laptop and headed toward the roof, where representatives of the most powerful military and intelligence agencies in the world were waiting to ask her how America could better prepare for the cyber wars of the future. The shy freshman had become the teacher, and her first lesson was simple. Sometimes the most important discoveries come from those who have learned to see clearly because nobody was looking at them. The transformation was complete, but Zoe understood that it was also just the beginning. The world had changed, technology would continue evolving, and new threats would emerge that required innovative solutions from minds that could think beyond conventional limitations. She had proven that one overlooked student could reshape an entire field, and now she would spend her career ensuring that the next generation of overlooked students would have the support and recognition they needed to do the same. As the Black Hawks powered down and their passengers began disembarking, Zoe walked toward a future where quiet observation, careful analysis, and principled courage would be recognized as the foundation of true expertise. The girl who had arrived at Westfield with everything to prove had discovered that the most important thing she could do was help others prove themselves, transforming a system that had once rejected her into one that would nurture the next generation of innovative minds. The helicopters on the roof were just the beginning of a story that would reshape how America thought about education, expertise, and the kind of minds needed to protect a digital civilization. And it had all started with a shy freshman whom everyone had ignored until her quiet voice became impossible to silence. Part 4. The Moment of Truth. The crisis began at 6:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning when Zoe's phone erupted with emergency alerts. That made her blood freeze. Major cyber attack detected across multiple government facilities. All available cybersecurity personnel report immediately. This was followed by a second message that made her heart stop entirely. Westfield Technical Institute experiencing complete network failure. Unknown hostile intrusion detected. Zoe threw on clothes and raced across campus to find chaos unlike anything she'd ever witnessed. Emergency vehicles surrounded every major building, their red and blue lights painting the Vermont morning in surreal colors. Students stood in confused clusters, their phones and laptops useless as the university's entire digital infrastructure had gone dark. Professor Klein met her at the entrance to Thornton Hall, his usually calm demeanor replaced by barely controlled urgency. Zoe, thank God you're here. Whatever hit us is unlike anything we've seen before. It's not just taking down our systems. It's actively destroying data as it spreads. Inside the building, Zoe found Lieutenant Colonel Parker coordinating with a team of federal agents and military technicians who had apparently arrived within minutes of the attack's detection. The main computer lab had been transformed into an emergency command center, with portable servers and communication equipment, creating a technological battlefield in the middle of an academic building. "Miss Nakamura," Parker called out immediately. Upon seeing her, "We need you to understand something critical. This isn't just an attack on Westfield. Similar intrusions have been detected at 17 universities, 12 government research facilities, and 6 major defense contractors across the eastern seaboard. Someone is conducting coordinated digital warfare against American research infrastructure." Agent Rebecca Torres from the Department of Homeland Security approached with a tablet displaying attack visualizations that made Zoe's earlier discoveries look simple by comparison. "The malware is unlike anything in our databases. It appears to learn from each system it compromises, adapting its methods in real time to overcome defensive measures. Every time we implement a countermeasure, it evolves a new approach within minutes." Zoe studied the data flows with growing recognition and mounting horror. The attack patterns were sophisticated beyond anything she'd previously encountered, but there was something familiar about their underlying structure. "This is the same group I identified 8 months ago," she said, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the command center. "But they've weaponized everything they learned from infiltrating university networks. They're not just stealing research anymore. They're destroying it to prevent American technological advancement." Dr. Voss, who had been standing uncertainly at the edge of the activity, stepped forward with obvious confusion. "Miss Nakamura, are you suggesting that the network intrusions you reported last year are connected to this current assault?" "They're not just connected," Zoe replied, moving to an available workstation and beginning her analysis. "This is the logical evolution of the same operation. The university infiltrations were reconnaissance and preparation. The attackers spent months learning how our research networks function, identifying critical vulnerabilities, and positioning themselves for exactly this kind of coordinated destruction." The main display screen showed a real-time map of the United States with red indicators spreading like a digital plague across the eastern half of the country. Each red dot represented a compromised facility, and new ones were appearing every few minutes as the attack expanded its reach. "MIT is reporting complete data loss in their quantum computing research division," announced one of the federal technicians. "Johns Hopkins has lost 3 years of biomedical research data. The National Institutes of Health are experiencing systematic destruction of pandemic preparedness databases." Lieutenant Colonel Parker turned to Zoe with the desperate expression of someone who had exhausted conventional options. "Miss Nakamura, your Shepherd protocol is the only defensive system that's shown any effectiveness against this type of adaptive malware. Can it be deployed at the scale needed to counter this attack?" Zoe was already analyzing the problem, her mind racing through the computational and logistical challenges of implementing her system across dozens of compromised networks simultaneously. The current version of the Shepherd protocol was designed for single network deployment. "To coordinate defense across this many systems, I'll need to completely restructure the core algorithms and create a distributed command architecture that can operate even when primary communication networks are compromised." "How long would that take?" Agent Torres asked, her voice tight with stress. "Under normal circumstances, 6 months minimum," Zoe replied, her fingers already flying across the keyboard as she began emergency modifications to her code. "But we don't have 6 months. Based on the progression rate I'm seeing, they'll have destroyed critical research data at every major institution on the eastern seaboard within 18 hours. Around the command center, Federal agents and military personnel exchanged grim looks. The scope of the disaster was becoming clear, and traditional cybersecurity measures had proven completely ineffective against malware that could evolve faster than human analysts could respond. Marcus Reed appeared at Zoe's workstation, his usual swagger replaced by something approaching desperation. "Zoe, I know we've had our differences, but I want to help. My internship contacts at major tech companies, my experience with enterprise, security systems, whatever you need." For a moment, Zoe considered the irony of Marcus offering assistance after months of dismissing her capabilities. But the crisis was too serious for personal grievances. "I need someone who understands distributed system architecture to help parallelize the defensive algorithms. Can you handle advanced concurrent programming?" Marcus nodded eagerly, taking a seat at the adjacent workstation. "I've been working with parallel processing systems since sophomore year. Just tell me what you need." Over the next 4 hours, Zoe orchestrated what could only be described as an emergency miracle of software engineering. Working with Marcus Kai-chun and several other advanced students, she deconstructed her original Shepard protocol and rebuilt it as a distributed defense network capable of protecting dozens of institutions. Simultaneously, the work required not just technical skill, but creative problem-solving that pushed the boundaries of conventional cybersecurity thinking. Traditional defensive systems were designed to protect static networks with predictable traffic patterns. But the current attack involved malware that could mimic legitimate research activities while systematically destroying the data it appeared to be accessing. "I'm implementing behavioral analysis protocols," Zoe explained to Lieutenant Colonel Parker as she worked. "Instead of just looking for malicious code signatures, the system will analyze the intent behind data access patterns. Research activities have characteristic fingerprints that can be distinguished from destructive operations, even when the malware is trying to mimic legitimate usage." Dr. Voss, who had been watching the emergency response with obvious admiration, approached Zoe's workstation. "Miss Nakamura, what you're attempting requires understanding not just computer systems, but human research behaviors across multiple academic disciplines. How can you possibly account for the variety of legitimate activities that occur across so many different institutions?" "Because I've been studying those patterns for almost a year," Zoe replied without looking up from her screen. "Every network I've monitored, every research database I've analyzed, they all contain signatures of how real scientists and researchers interact with data. The attackers can mimic the technical aspects of these interactions, but they can't replicate the subtle behavioral patterns that reflect genuine intellectual curiosity and scientific methodology." As the hours passed, the scope of the disaster continued expanding. Stanford University reported catastrophic data loss in their artificial intelligence research programs. The Centers for Disease Control announced that years of epidemiological research had been corrupted beyond recovery. Military research facilities were experiencing systematic destruction of classified projects that represented decades of scientific advancement. "The President has been briefed on the situation," Agent Torres announced after receiving a secure communication. "This attack is being treated as an act of cyber warfare. All available government resources are being mobilized to support recovery efforts." But Zoe knew that recovery efforts would be meaningless if the attack couldn't be stopped. The malware was designed not just to steal information, but to render it permanently inaccessible, ensuring that even if the intrusion was eventually detected, the damage would be irreversible. At 2:47 p.m., exactly 8 hours after the attack had begun, Zoe announced that the modified Shepard protocol was ready for deployment. "But I need something that's never been granted to a civilian before," she said, addressing Lieutenant Colonel Parker directly. "I need administrative access to every compromised network simultaneously, including classified government systems and private corporate databases." The request was unprecedented. giving a college student root access to dozens of sensitive networks, violated every protocol for information security and government operations. But as the red indicators on the status map continued multiplying, conventional protocols seemed irrelevant compared to preventing the complete destruction of American research capabilities. "I'm making the call," Parker said, reaching for his secure communications device. "But Zoe, you need to understand that if this deployment fails, or if there are any unintended consequences, the responsibility will fall on everyone in this room." "Colonel," Zoe replied, meeting his gaze directly, "if we don't try this, there won't be any research infrastructure left to protect." The authorization process that normally required weeks of review and approval was compressed into 47 minutes of emergency consultations that reached the highest levels of government. When the final clearances came through, they arrived with a weight of responsibility that Zoe had never experienced before. "Deployment authorization confirmed," Agent Torres announced. "Miss Nakamura, you now have emergency administrative privileges for every affected network. This level of access has never been granted to anyone outside the intelligence community." Zoe began the deployment sequence, watching as her modified Shepherd protocol spread across compromised networks like digital medicine fighting a systemic infection. The system's artificial intelligence components immediately began analyzing attack patterns and implementing countermeasures that adapted to the malware's evolutionary strategies. The initial results were promising. Networks that had been experiencing catastrophic data loss began stabilizing as the Shepherd protocol identified and neutralized destructive processes. But Zoe could see that the attackers were responding to her defensive measures, modifying their malware to overcome the new obstacles. "They're learning from our countermeasures faster than I expected," she told Lieutenant Colonel Parker. "This is turning into an intelligence battle where both sides are evolving their strategies in real time." What followed was 6 hours of what could only be described as digital warfare between Zoe's defensive systems and some of the most sophisticated cybercriminals in the world. Every move was countered by an opposing move. Every strategy was met with an adapted counter-strategy, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The breakthrough came when Zoe realized that her adversaries were making a fundamental error in their approach. They were treating each compromised network as an isolated target. But Zoe understood that research institutions were interconnected through collaboration patterns and shared methodologies that created predictable behaviors. "I know how to stop them permanently," she announced suddenly, her voice cutting through the tense atmosphere of the command center. "They're attacking our systems like isolated networks, but scientific research creates behavioral patterns that cross institutional boundaries. If I can predict where they'll attack next based on research collaboration networks, I can position defenses before they arrive." Lieutenant Colonel Parker leaned over her shoulder as she implemented her new strategy. Instead of simply reacting to attacks as they occurred, the Shepherd protocol would anticipate likely targets based on analysis of scientific collaboration patterns and research funding relationships. "You're turning cybersecurity into predictive behavioral science," Parker observed. "Instead of just protecting individual systems, you're modeling the entire research ecosystem and positioning defenses where attacks are most likely to occur." The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Attack after attack failed as the Shepherd protocol anticipated assault vectors before they were fully implemented. A sophisticated malware that had threatened to destroy decades of American research found itself consistently outmaneuvered by defensive systems that seemed to understand the attackers' strategic objectives better than they understood them themselves. By 11:30 p.m., 14 hours after the assault had begun, a coordinated cyber attack had been completely neutralized. The malware that had threatened to cripple American research infrastructure had been systematically defeated by a defensive system created by a sophomore college student working with emergency resources in a converted computer lab. As federal agents began securing the command center and military personnel prepared their after-action reports, Lieutenant Colonel Parker approached Zoe with an expression that mixed profound relief with something approaching awe. "Miss Nakamura," he said, "what you accomplished today prevented a catastrophe that could have set American scientific research back by decades. The President asked me to convey that you'll be receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom and that Congress will be voting on special recognition for your service to national security." Dr. Voss approached hesitantly, her earlier skepticism replaced by obvious admiration and what might have been shame. "Zoe, I need to say something that I should have said months ago. I was wrong about everything. Your capabilities, your potential, your place in this program. You've demonstrated a level of innovative thinking and practical skill that surpasses anything I've seen in 30 years of academic cybersecurity." Marcus Reed, who had spent the day working as Zoe's assistant after months of dismissing her abilities, stood nearby with the hollow expression of someone whose entire worldview had been fundamentally challenged. "I don't understand how I got everything so wrong," he said quietly. "All those times I said you didn't have the experience or the tools or the background. But you saw things that none of us could see." Zoe looked at him for a moment, remembering every snide comment and dismissive laugh, every time he'd made her feel inadequate and out of place. She could have been cruel in her moment of complete vindication, could have returned every humiliation with interest. Instead, she said simply, "Marcus, you were looking for validation of what you already knew. I was trying to understand what I didn't know yet. Sometimes the second approach works better." As the emergency response teams packed their equipment and the command center returned to being a computer lab, Zoe found herself alone with Professor Klein, who had observed the entire crisis response with quiet pride. "You know," he said, "when you first came to my office hours last year, I could see that you had potential. But I never imagined you'd become the person who would save American research infrastructure from destruction." "Professor," Zoe replied, "I'm still the same person who couldn't afford textbooks and didn't know anyone in the industry. I just learned that those limitations forced me to see things differently, and sometimes different perspectives reveal things that conventional approaches miss." That night, alone in her dorm room while emergency response teams continued their work across campus, Zoe stared at her reflection and tried to process the magnitude of what had occurred. The shy freshman who had been dismissed as lacking proper credentials had just prevented one of the most devastating cyber attacks in history. But more importantly, she had proven that innovative thinking and careful observation could triumph over sophisticated resources and conventional expertise. The girl everyone had ignored had become impossible to overlook, not through self-promotion or political connections, but by consistently being right when it mattered most. As she prepared for what she knew would be a very different tomorrow, Zoe heard the distant sound of helicopters approaching campus. Looking out her window, she could see military aircraft circling the university before beginning their descent toward the roof of her dormitory building. The shy freshman who had arrived with second-hand clothes and a used laptop was about to discover that saving the nation's research infrastructure was just the beginning of a much larger responsibility. The girl everyone had ignored was about to become the most important voice in American cybersecurity, whether she was ready for that role or not. Part 5. The complete transformation, the sound of rotor blades cutting through Vermont air grew louder as 3 Black Hawk helicopters descended toward Pine Ridge Dormitory, their landing lights illuminating the frost-covered roof in stark white circles. Students poured from buildings across campus, phones raised to capture video of military aircraft landing at their quiet technical institute. For most of them, this was the first confirmation that something extraordinary had happened in their midst. Zoe watched from her third-floor window as the helicopters touched down with military precision. She could see uniformed personnel emerging from the aircraft, followed by civilians in expensive suits who moved with the purposeful efficiency of high-ranking government officials. Whatever was about to happen would change everything once again. A knock on her door interrupted her observations. When she opened it, she found Lieutenant Colonel Parker accompanied by a woman in her 50s, wearing the kind of perfectly tailored business attire that suggested serious government authority. "Miss Nakamura," Parker said, "I'd like you to meet Director Sarah Hendricks from the National Security Agency. She's here to discuss your immediate future." Director Hendricks extended her hand with a smile that managed to be both warm and professionally calculated. "Miss Nakamura, 3 days ago, I was briefing the President on the most serious cyber threat our nation has faced since the Internet became critical infrastructure. Today I'm here to offer you opportunities that will reshape how America approaches digital security for the next generation." They walked together toward the roof access, passing groups of students who stared at Zoe with expressions ranging from awe to confusion. The girl they'd barely noticed for 2 years was apparently important, enough to warrant a personal visit from military helicopters and federal officials. On the roof, Zoe found herself in the center of what looked like a high-level government conference that happened to be taking place on top of a college dormitory. Secretary of Defense Patricia Morrison stood near one of the helicopters, engaged in intense conversation with officials from various agencies. Congressional staffers moved between groups, taking notes and coordinating what appeared to be multiple simultaneous briefings. "Miss Nakamura," Secretary Morrison said, approaching with the commanding presence that had made her one of the most respected leaders in government. "Yesterday you prevented what our analysts estimate would have been the most devastating cyber attack in American history. 17 universities, 12 government facilities, and 6 major defense contractors would have lost decades of research if not for your intervention." The weight of this assessment settled over Zoe like a heavy blanket. She'd known the attack was serious, but hearing the scope quantified by the Secretary of Defense made the magnitude almost incomprehensible. The economic impact alone would have exceeded $200 billion, continued Dr. James Chun, a senior analyst from the Department of Homeland Security. But more importantly, the loss of research data would have set back American technological advancement by years in critical areas like quantum computing, advanced materials, and biotechnology. Director Hendricks gestured toward the other officials gathered on the roof. "What you accomplished has caught the attention of everyone who matters in national security. The President, Congress, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, intelligence leadership. They all want to understand how a sophomore college student succeeded where our most advanced systems failed." "The answer is simple," said General Patricia Martinez, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who had apparently arrived on one of the helicopters. Miss Nakamura wasn't constrained by conventional thinking about what cyber threats should look like or how defensive systems should operate. She solved problems that experienced analysts couldn't see because she approached them without preconceptions about established methods. Secretary Morrison opened a briefcase and removed several official-looking documents. "Miss Nakamura, we're here to offer you several options for your immediate future. The first is full funding for your education at any institution in the country, followed by a position in the NSA's Cyber Threat Intelligence Division with a starting salary higher than most government officials earn after decades of service. The second option," Director Hendricks continued, "is immediate appointment as Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity Innovation, REPORTING, directly to the National Security Council. You would have unprecedented access to intelligence resources and the authority to develop defensive systems for the entire federal government." General Martinez stepped forward with the third option. "The Pentagon would like to establish a new cyber warfare research institute with you as its founding director. Unlimited budget, access to the most advanced computing resources in the world, and the mission of preparing America for the digital battlefields of the future." The offers were staggering in their scope and implications. Any one of them would transform Zoe's life completely, placing her at the center of American national security apparatus with resources and authority that most career professionals never achieved. But before Zoe could respond, Professor Klein appeared on the roof, having apparently convinced security personnel that his presence was necessary. "If I may," he said, addressing the assembled officials with unusual boldness, "you're all missing something important about Miss Nakamura's success." Secretary Morrison raised an eyebrow at the interruption. "Professor Klein, isn't it? What exactly are we missing?" "You're treating Zoe's achievements as if they happened despite her educational environment rather than because of it," Professor Klein replied. "But her breakthrough came from combining advanced theoretical knowledge with practical problem-solving, skills developed through academic collaboration. The university setting wasn't an obstacle to overcome. It was an essential component of her success." Dr. Voss, who had somehow gained access to the roof gathering, stepped forward with obvious nervousness. "What Professor Klein is suggesting is that Miss Nakamura's innovations emerged from the intersection of academic research and real-world applications. Removing her from the educational environment might actually limit her future effectiveness." Zoe looked around at the officials, professors, and military personnel gathered on her dormitory roof, all waiting for her decision about opportunities that would determine the direction of her entire life. For a moment, she felt the same uncertainty that had plagued her during those early months when everyone seemed to know more than she did about how the world worked. "I appreciate all of these offers," she said finally, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had developed over months of being proven right about things that mattered. "But I think Professor Klein and Dr. Voss have identified something important. My solutions worked because I was thinking about problems differently, not because I had access to better resources or established expertise." Director Hendricks leaned forward with obvious interest. "What are you suggesting, Miss Nakamura?" "I'm suggesting that America's cybersecurity challenges won't be solved by doing more of what we've always done, even if we do it with better funding and more authority," Zoe replied. "They'll be solved by developing new approaches that combine innovative thinking with collaborative development and real-world testing." Secretary Morrison exchanged glances with General Martinez before responding. "Are you proposing an alternative to the options we've presented?" Zoe took a breath, knowing that what she was about to suggest would surprise everyone present. "I want to stay at Westfield and establish a new kind of cybersecurity program that brings together students, researchers, and government officials to develop solutions collaboratively. Instead of separating academic research from practical applications, we'd create an environment where innovative thinking could be tested and refined in real-world conditions." The proposal hung in the air like a challenge to conventional assumptions about how important work gets accomplished. Government officials were accustomed to recruiting talent away from universities, not establishing permanent partnerships that might complicate established hierarchies and procedures. "Miss Nakamura," General Martinez said carefully, "what you're describing would require unprecedented cooperation between academic institutions and classified government operations. The security and oversight challenges alone would be enormous." "The challenges of not doing it are bigger," Zoe replied. "Yesterday's attack succeeded initially because our defensive systems were designed by people who thought about cyber threats in conventional ways. The next attack will be even more sophisticated, and will need solutions that come from minds that aren't constrained by established methods." Lieutenant Colonel Parker, who had been unusually quiet during the discussion, stepped forward with a slight smile. "Director Hendricks, I think Miss Nakamura has just proposed something that addresses a problem we've been struggling with for years. How do we maintain innovative thinking within established security frameworks?" "By creating new frameworks that support innovation while maintaining necessary security," Zoe said. "Westfield could become a testing ground for collaborative cybersecurity development, where students and professionals work together on real threats under controlled conditions." Dr. Voss, emboldened by the direction of the conversation, added her support. The university would provide the academic environment necessary for theoretical development, while government partnerships would ensure practical relevance and real-world testing opportunities. Secretary Morrison studied Zoe with the calculating expression of someone reassessing fundamental assumptions. Ms. Nakamura, what you're proposing would essentially create a new model for how America develops cybersecurity capabilities. Are you confident that this approach would be more effective than traditional methods? I'm confident that it's worth testing, Zoe replied. And if it works, it could be replicated at other institutions to create a nationwide network of collaborative cybersecurity development centers. The discussion continued for another hour as officials considered the implications and logistics of Zoe's proposal. What emerged was a plan that would transform Westfield Technical Institute into the first academic government cybersecurity partnership of its kind, with Zoe as its director and primary researcher. The new program would receive unprecedented funding and access to classified information, while maintaining the academic freedom necessary for innovative research. Students from around the world would compete for admission to study collaborative cybersecurity development, and the most promising graduates would continue their careers in government service. As the sun set over the Vermont mountains, the officials began returning to their helicopters with agreements in principle for a partnership that would reshape both cybersecurity education and national defense strategy. The shy freshman who had been dismissed as lacking proper credentials would now oversee a program that would train the next generation of digital warriors. Miss Nakamura, Director Hendricks said as she prepared to board her helicopter, 6 months ago you were a student whom your own department tried to transfer to an easier program. Today you're directing the future of American cybersecurity. What would you tell other students who might be facing similar dismissal of their abilities? Zoe considered the question as she looked across campus toward the buildings where she'd spent so many lonely hours working on problems that everyone else had dismissed as unimportant. I'd tell them that being different isn't a disadvantage. If you're different in ways that matter, the things that made me seem inadequate by conventional standards turned out to be exactly what was needed for unconventional challenges. As the Black Hawks lifted off from the dormitory roof, their rotor wash scattering leaves across the campus quad, students gathered to watch the military aircraft disappear into the evening sky. Most of them were still trying to understand how their quiet classmate had become important enough to warrant personal visits from the highest levels of government. Brooke Sterling, Zoe's roommate, who had spent 2 years barely acknowledging her existence, approached with obvious confusion and what might have been respect. Zoe, I don't understand what just happened, but everyone's saying you saved the entire country from some kind of cyber attack. Is that really true? I helped prevent a serious problem, Zoe replied simply. But the more important thing is that we're going to build systems to prevent even more serious problems in the future. Marcus Reed, whose transformation from arrogant critic to humbled collaborator had been complete, joined the conversation. Zoe, when the new program starts, I'd like to apply to be part of it. I know I have a lot to learn about approaching problems differently, but I want to contribute if you'll have me. Marcus, Zoe said, the program will need people with different backgrounds and perspectives. Your experience with traditional methods will be valuable for understanding why new approaches are necessary. Professor Klein appeared at Zoe's shoulder, still marveling at the events of the day. You know, when you first came to my office hours, I thought you had potential. But I never imagined that potential would reshape how America thinks about cybersecurity, education, and national defense. Professor, Zoe replied, I'm still the same person who couldn't afford textbooks and didn't have industry connections. The only thing that's changed is that now people are listening when I talk about problems that matter. That evening, alone in her dorm room for what would be one of the last times as a regular student, Zoe reflected on the journey that had brought her from dismissed outsider to the director of a program that would influence national security for generations. The transformation had been complete, but she understood that it was also just the beginning of much larger responsibilities. The girl everyone had ignored had become impossible to overlook, not through political maneuvering or self-promotion, but by consistently being right about things that mattered more than grades or social acceptance. She had proven that quiet observation, innovative thinking, and principled determination could triumph over established expertise and conventional resources. As she prepared for sleep, Zoe could hear helicopters in the distance, probably returning. Government officials to Washington, where they would brief the president on the new cybersecurity partnership that would begin with a shy freshman who had refused to accept that being different meant being inadequate. The sound faded into the Vermont night, but Zoe knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities that would test everything she'd learned about turning perceived weaknesses into unexpected strengths. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.